For our next interview, we're going to go a little bit outside the box. When people think of politics as usual, I think that the conversation generally tends towards what's going on in Washington, what's going on in the state capitol. But I'd suggest to you that perhaps the most real politics of all is what happens in your own backyard, in particular what happens with your local schools, with your school board. To me, one of the most important topics, if not the most important topic for my household, is the education of my children. And America nowadays seems to have problems keeping up with our educational programs. And when we get scored internationally, our scores don't do very well. So I thought we'd take a little bit of a detour today, like I said, a little bit outside the box, and drill down and have a conversation about local school boards and the politics of local school boards, local school board elections. In order to get there, we're going to draw from our friends at Ballotpedia. And again, as you know, I'm a big fan of Ballotpedia. It's a great source for political information. And Ballotpedia has started a school board project, and we have with us today Daniel, I got to find your last name here, Daniel Anderson, and he is the head of the school board project. So Daniel, thank you for joining us today, and maybe by way of introduction, you can tell us a little bit about what the school board project means and how it works at Ballotpedia.
Sure. Well, thank you for your time today. The School Board Elections Project with Ballotpedia began earlier this year during the late spring, early summer, and the basic idea is to cover the top 1,000 school districts in the United States of America as measured by enrollment, as total student enrollment. So, as you might imagine, the top few school districts are, say, the New York City Department of Education, maybe Denver Public Schools for a more local example. And what we do is we cover what's happening in those school districts, so the annual budget, academic performance, teacher salaries, that sort of information. And we also cover the school board elections in those 1,000 school districts. So we have pages on the election itself and each of the candidates.
So let me understand this. You keep a range of statistics, including academic performance. So if someone is in one of these top 1,000 school districts and they want to know how their school district's performing, they can go on Ballotpedia and actually look at academic performance?
That's correct. We're still building up the top 1,000 school districts, so it's possible that your school district may not have those statistics yet, but we're well on our way there. And since there isn't really a national set of standards for academic performance, usually what we use is most states have some sort of standardized test that the state uses internally. So those are the statistics we usually gather.
And then are you going to, at some point, offer comparative data so someone living in New York can compare their schools to Denver and, as you said, these other school districts?
We're going to do the best we can to do those sorts of comparisons and studies, because that's really, ultimately, that's sort of what people want to know is how does my school district stack up, not only against the next door district, but against the big districts across the country. We can only really work with the statistics that are out there. Sometimes standardized tests are just too different from one another to really compare. But when possible, we're absolutely going to make those sorts of comparisons.
And same thing on budgeting. What type of budget information will you have online, and where do you get that from?
In almost all cases, we get the budgets from the school district website, and we divide those budgets into a few different categories. Staff expenses, so salaries, wages, benefits, operational expenses, student services, debt servicing, and other expenses, and then we have the total budget figure. In some cases, school districts don't actually bother to post their annual budget online. So in those cases, we get the budgets from either a state database, a few different states have databases for school district budgets, or we can actually get slightly older data from the United States Census Bureau.
So as I said earlier, I find this topic fascinating and so relevant today in terms of anyone who has children, they want to know how the school district's doing. What was the impetus for this? How did you or Leslie Graves or the think tank back at Validpedia? What caused you to get this project started?
Well, it's really what Ballotpedia is trying to do is connect people to politics. And it's less difficult to do that on the federal level because most people are interested in who the president is, who their congressman is. But as you mentioned at the start of this, there are very important decisions being made on the local level. Um, so we've started a municipal government project recently, and before that, we started the school board elections project because we recognize that school board members are making hugely important decisions. They're deciding who the superintendent of the school district is, or they're firing the superintendent. They're approving budgets in the ranges of hundreds of millions of dollars. And voter turnout in these elections are usually very, very low. So we thought that this was a really important place where we could help people to understand school boards better, to understand school board elections better, to provide them more information so that they could get more involved.
Now, your site is a wiki site, and we have talked about that in another program. You haven't been up and running that long. Are you finding that people are becoming engaged and joining you at that level and giving you feedback and input so far, or is that a little too young in the process?
Well, I imagine the other projects might be receiving even more input, but we've received a significant amount of reader interest, whether that's just page views, or we've also received a lot of information from local citizens saying, hey, I noticed that your profile of this candidate running in my school district doesn't have a picture, or it doesn't mention where he went to college. And maybe that information isn't available anywhere, but I know the guy. I can get you that information. Or sometimes it's the candidates themselves who contact us. So we are receiving a significant amount of reader engagement. People are interested in these school board elections.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. On our show, what we're trying to do is get people engaged, and I think if by you drilling down to the local school board level, that's something that people might be able to grab on a little too more easily. As you said, you'll get a call from someone, it's my buddy, right? It's more personal to them. It's at that level. We talked to one of our last shows about the fact that voter turnout is so low across the board in the United States. First of all, registration is low, and then turnout is low. What is the average turnout for a school board election? Is there such a thing as an average turnout?
Well, there has to be an average turnout statistically. I can't tell you definitively or authoritatively what the average turnout is across the board. There's what's interesting about talking about local education and public education is there's disagreement about the most fundamental statistics. For example, the National Center for Education Statistics says there's around 13,000 school districts in the country. The United States Census Bureau says, oh no, there's more than 14,000. So statistics that simple are disputed. There is an agreement. I can say that on average, from what we've found from our research and our coverage of elections in the latter half of 2013, we found that between 5 to 10% turnout seems to be about the norm.
Wait,
and there are cases where you'll see even lower than that.
You said 10% turnout?
5 to 10%.
Now, is that 5 to 10% of the registered voters or of the eligible voters?
I believe it's of the eligible voters, although in some cases it's absolutely of the registered voters. There are some school districts where it's just incredibly low.
And I think that's an example here of some of the math we were doing on an earlier show. I some statistics, I don't recall them exactly, where basically there's over 200 million people that could register to vote in the United States, but 60-some million don't even register to begin with, and then another 20 million don't vote. So in the presidential election, you had 80 million out of 200-some million that didn't show up. But if I'm hearing you correctly, in your district, you may have a voter population of 10,000, let's say, and only 500 are showing up to vote?
Sure, that has absolutely happened before.
It's fairly disgusting. In most cases, are school boards, how are they getting slated? Do they go through a primary process, party-based process? Is it nonpartisan? How are these fields developed to get on the ballot in the first place?
Well, the first thing to understand about school board elections is that there's no consistent standard whatsoever. Certainly not across the country, usually not in the same state, sometimes not even the same region of a state. So the answer is really all of the above. What's most common is nonpartisan elections where candidates file with the local city clerk or the county clerk, sometimes with the school district itself, and so they file to run, and then there's a general election, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That plurality system. But what happens sometimes is sometimes there are primary elections or runoff elections. And you mentioned parties, and that's a really interesting thing about school board elections that most people don't realize is there are partisan school board elections. They're not incredibly common, but they're not incredibly rare either. Um, Usually they pop up in just a handful of states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. But even in those cases, it doesn't really work how you might think. For example, in Virginia, most school board candidates can decide to file as a partisan candidate, as a Republican, as a Democrat. But in the vast majority of cases we've seen, they've decided to run as an independent. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, candidates have the option of cross filing, which means that a candidate can file to run in both the Democratic and the Republican nomination races, primary races. Just imagine Mitt Romney cross filing to run for the Democratic nomination and the Republican nomination. It's so even when there are partisan school board elections, you'll see a lot of instances where candidates go out of their way to appear nonpartisan.
We had a phenomenon here locally in Aspen Snowmass School District where we did not have a full slate of candidates. Are you finding across the country that they are attracting a full slate of candidates and it's competitive, or is it not necessarily being competitive?
Usually, what you'll see is that there is a full slate of candidates, but the candidates are either running unopposed or they're facing one or two challengers at most. Sometimes you'll see really competitive races, and those turn out to be very interesting.
Yeah,
But sometimes,
yeah, and I think I think that's unfortunate that maybe one of the most critical elected positions we have in our country, deciding who the superintendent's going to be, setting the budget, making decisions on pension, and this whole range of decisions, is really not competitive. It's not really part of an elective process. It's almost a volunteer process at the end of the day. As you said, people run unopposed. And then you wake up one day and you look at your school systems, and I'm not picking anyone's school system, and say, our country's suffering. So I would hope we could get to the point where we could get this a little more competitive, and maybe our show can help boost some people to get active in that level. Quickly, as in our remaining time, and when I say remaining time, I'm thinking we should do more on this in another segment. So let's you and I talk about that.
Okay.
Anyone who wants to find out about your project, get the Ballotpedia and drill down and look at their district, get the data. How do they get there? Give them some guidelines on how to work your site and how to get the most out of it.
Sure. Well, the website is ballotpedia.org, and when you click on there, the main page, you'll see a map of the United States, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see some bullet points with links to our various projects, so Congress, state legislatures, ballot measures, and school boards. If you click on the school boards link, you'll come to a portal page where, again, there's a map of the United States. So you can click on your state to be brought to a page that might be something like Colorado school districts. And from there, you'll find links to a list of school districts in Colorado, specific school district pages, list of elections in Colorado. So that would be the primary way of navigating the website. And we absolutely encourage everyone to look into their local school boards to get engaged. If you see that we don't have the information that you're looking for on that page, let us know. All the time we're adding new components, new information to these pages to make them better and more accessible for readers.
Well, Daniel, great luck with your project. As always, I think you guys at Ballotpedia are a little bit ahead of your time, And I encourage anyone that's watching this segment to, again, get on Ballotpedia, get engaged in your school district, find out when the elections are, and look at these budgets, look at these decisions that are being made, and then again, make the input. So thank you, all the best to you, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.